Welcome again to our journey toward Easter, and thank you for joining us. Today, I'd like for us to consider together what this journey's been like for one of the key figures in the story, and that's Peter. Now, I chose Peter because I think that he's somebody that we can identify with in a lot of ways. So today, let's take some time and revisit four scenes from Peter's journey. And we'll begin the night that Jesus was arrested with scene one, a scene that takes place in the upper room. The upper room is a room that we're familiar with. We've been here before on this journey. It's the room where Jesus has arranged to share his final Passover with the disciples. It's the room where he washes their feet. And it's the room where they have this interesting interaction. As Jesus is addressing the disciples, he tells them at one point that you will all fall away because of me. And when Peter hears those words, he immediately objects and says, Jesus, no. Even if everyone else falls away, not me. I'm going to be standing right there by your side. But Jesus knows better. And so he tells Peter that before the rooster crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. Peter's response? Even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you. What a bold promise. What a bold proclamation of faithfulness Peter utters. That boldness shouldn't surprise us coming from him. I mean, after all, this is the same Peter who walked on the water, right? It's the same Peter that saw Jesus transfigured in front of his eyes. It's the Peter that we've grown to love, the Peter who's impetuous and bold. And so as he makes this bold promise, we're not surprised. And as he makes this bold promise, I'm sure that he meant every word of it. In that moment, he was convinced that there's no way that he would ever let Jesus down. And that takes us to scene 2, which takes place in the garden, that garden where Jesus is praying with Peter, James, and John nearby. It's in that garden that the enemies of Jesus finally arrive. And they arrive with their torches and spears with a very clear agenda to arrest this Jesus. Now, Peter can't bear the thought of Jesus being arrested, and being true to the words that he uttered in the upper room, he decides to do something about it. So he drew his sword and he struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Jesus immediately heals the servant and tells Peter to put away his sword. You can almost imagine the chaos of this scene, and it's in the chaos that we read that they all forsook Jesus and fled, even Peter. But we're not done with Peter, because the third scene is where we find him again. And in the third scene, we are in the courtyard of the high priest during the trial of Jesus. You see, in the garden, the soldiers arrest Jesus and take him to the house now of the high priest. So Jesus is on trial for his life, and Peter is sitting with the guards, warming himself by the fire. While he's there, a young woman recognizes him and simply asks if he is one of the followers of this Jesus. And Peter denies it. 2 more times during that night, Peter is recognized and accused of being a follower of Jesus. And 2 more times, Peter denies the accusation. Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Our fourth scene is still there in the courtyard, but the focus shifts as Jesus is once again brought into the scene. And as Peter denies Jesus that final time, it's at that moment Jesus turns and looks over toward Peter. And Peter remembers what Jesus had told him, how he would deny him 3 times that night. I'm sure that Peter not only remembered what Jesus had told him, but I'm sure that Peter also remembered the way that he stood up to Jesus and the way that he assured Jesus that that would not happen. But now, it has happened. And Peter looks into the eyes of Jesus after failing so miserably. And it's no wonder that Luke tells us that Peter went out and wept bitterly. You and I can imagine the emotion of this scene. We can just feel it, can't we? We can feel the brokenness of Peter's heart as Jesus looked at him. We can imagine the grief that washed over Peter as he realizes that he's just done what he swore he would never do. And not only can we feel the emotion of that moment, and not only can we feel the pain that Peter is feeling, we can identify with it a lot. I mean, like Peter, there are times when we are so strong, or at least we think we're strong. And then there's those other times, those times when we're so weak. You know, we've stood in church and we've made our proclamations of faith, and like Peter, we meant every word of it. But then we left that place, and at some point we found ourselves doing things we shouldn't have done, and saying things we shouldn't have said, and thinking things we shouldn't have thought. We find ourselves in the courtyard with Peter, having failed. I guess the good news is that at least our failures haven't been recorded forever in the pages of Scripture for people to talk about on the internet thousands of years later. Well, maybe not, but they do stick with us, don't they? Our failures may not be as public as Peter's, but we still feel every bit of their sting. We still feel the shame and the embarrassment of those times that we've done things that we proclaimed we would never do. We've all felt the shame and the disappointment and the hurt of the courtyard. So we know where Peter stands. I know I said 4 scenes, but we can't leave Peter there, can we? We can't leave our story here. So let's fast forward and take in 2 more quick scenes. Scene 5 is there at the empty tomb. I know we're not there yet. We're not supposed to be there. But just for a moment, let's move quickly past the cross and past the death of Jesus to the morning of resurrection. It's on this morning a group of women show up to the now empty tomb, and they're greeted by an angel. And in part, the angel's message to them that morning was, go tell the disciples and Peter. The angel, speaking on Jesus' behalf, wants to make sure that Peter understands that when the disciples gather, he's invited. That when Jesus sees the disciples, he wants to see Peter. Let that sink in for just a moment, and you'll understand the importance of this, because the last interaction that Peter had with Jesus was that look they shared after Peter's failure. And now when Peter hears the rumors of Jesus' resurrection, I bet he is struggling with getting out from under the weight of that last interaction. Go tell the disciples and Peter. And that brings us to our 6th and final scene. A scene that takes place down by the lake on the beach. As Jesus and his disciples have gathered together, they're gathering around a fire. And there around that fire, Jesus invites Peter to profess his love. Not just once, not just twice, but 3 times. Sound familiar? Just as Jesus has been denied by Peter 3 times around the fire in the courtyard, now Jesus is leading Peter to proclaim his love 3 times around the fire by the sea. That, friends, is the beauty and the power of the cross. Because of the cross, Peter's denial does not have the final word. And it's not because Peter deserved another chance. It's because Jesus refuses to let Peter go. You see, Peter's story is not so much a story about failure as it is a story about restoration. And I think that's why it's so meaningful to me. As you know, Peter goes on from this moment to be used mightily by God. It's so important to see that God wasn't done with him when he failed. And I bet he's not done with you either. Friend, no matter what your past is like, no matter how many times you've done what you swore you would not do or would not do again, no matter how many times you've started and stopped and tried and failed, God is not done with you. He's waiting to forgive you. He's waiting to restore you. And he's waiting to use you. That is the message of the cross that I hope that you hear today. That God is standing with open arms, ready to welcome you, ready to forgive you, ready to make you new. And he is standing this very moment inviting you to join him in his transforming work in this world. Have a great rest of the week.